The year 2020 brought us an emotional trauma that we never saw coming, and that's been the COVID-19 pandemic. For nearly 2 months, we've been on lockdown, not only as a nation, but as a world. And this has literally been an emotional trauma. An emotional trauma can be the same as a physical trauma, like a car accident, okay? The challenge is a physical trauma, it's oftentimes easier to appreciate the dynamics of those injuries, while an emotional trauma is invisible. So oftentimes we're not aware of the injuries that we sustain from that trauma. Today, we're gonna explore how to come out of this pandemic and live life well again. When we examine a trauma like a car accident, it's important to realize that traumas change everything. And those same principles apply for an emotional trauma. When we are involved in a trauma, there are 5 important aspects about that trauma that it's so important for us to appreciate. Let's give the example of a car accident as a major physical trauma. The first is oftentimes we don't see that trauma about to happen. It's only those moments, those seconds before impact, that we start to see the development of that physical trauma, and we brace for that impact. The second is now we have to experience the trauma, whatever that may be. If that car's spinning, tumbling, rolling, but we have to go through that experience. The third is once that trauma comes to an end, is how do we get out of the wreckage? The fourth is now assessing our injuries and what is the healing process that's going to be required as we come out of that trauma. And the fifth, that is so important, is to understand how that trauma has now changed us and changed our life so we can move forward and reclaim our life. As we mentioned, traumas change everything. The challenge with a trauma, especially when we look at the example of a physical trauma like a car accident, is we judge the impact of that trauma by what's bleeding or broken. So if something's bleeding or broken, we think that's the only problem. And if nothing's bleeding or broken, we think everything's okay. However, in those moments, there's a tremendous amount of force and energy that our body has to absorb that can start to set up problems that we may not realize the effects of for days, weeks, and sometimes years later. And at that point, we may not appreciate the role that trauma played in what we're experiencing. If you look at 4 people involved in an automobile accident, they can sustain 4 different types of injuries. One may lose their life in that trauma. The other 2 may experience significant injuries that require them to be hospitalized. And the 4th person may seem to walk away without a scratch. Even that 4th person is impacted by that trauma, but they may not be aware of it. So one of the things that is most important for us is to appreciate and understand how this trauma has now impacted our life. Let's take the 2 people that suffered significant injuries. And now they've got to understand how to overcome the impact of those injuries and regain their life. One may be totally determined to do whatever is necessary to overcome those injuries and to regain their life. The second may be devastated by those injuries and simply want to give up. Which person is going to have the best opportunity to regain their life? And this example helps us to understand that it starts with our minds and how do we approach these injuries. The COVID-19 pandemic has been more of an emotional trauma than a physical trauma. And it can be much more challenging to understand the injuries that come from an emotional trauma. When we look at how humanity has been injured by this trauma, the greatest injury has been our mindset and emotions. We've become gripped by fear of a virus, fear of a hug, fear of a handshake, fear of going outside. While these have been some practical steps that we've had to take in order to help us get through this process, we have to better understand these fears so we can regain our lives and regain a life and a lifestyle that was better than before. So how do we overcome this fear? First, we overcome it by understanding the cause of the fear, and second, by knowing the solutions. We're afraid now of a virus, bacteria, germs. When we recognize that our body is made up of viruses and germs and bacteria, it's this whole ecosystem that's greater than we understand. We actually have more germs, bacteria, and viruses in our body than we do human cells. So our body is designed to manage these types of things. We just needed to put it in the best position possible. If we learn anything from this pandemic, it's the principle that our physical health is so important, and our mental emotional health is such an important part of our physical health. When we look at those greatest impacted by this experience, it's been those with issues that are called comorbidities, things like heart disease and diabetes, even those in a more advanced age when their bodies are in a more compromised state and not able to manage these obstacles effectively. So understanding how to better take care of ourselves is a key factor in overcoming this trauma. While understanding the source of our fear and what we're afraid of is so important, trusting the solutions is equally as important. The first is good hygiene. If we look throughout history, when we faced issues like this, the improvement of hygiene and sanitation has been critical in overcoming these issues. And now we're seeing ways to better improve our hygiene in today's culture. We also understand, if we learn nothing else from this process, that while the hygiene of our external world is important, improving the hygiene of our internal world is even more important. As we come through this trauma and look to reclaim our lives, it's important to recognize that life is about seasons, and this is simply another season of our lives. Many of us have missed athletics during this time as everything has been shut down, and athletics can be a great training ground for life, because life, like athletics, is made up of seasons. And in athletics, there are some seasons where you win championships and others where you get your butt kicked. But the measure of a true champion is how you handle both of those seasons. We can look back through history to learn from those that came before us, that experienced difficulties and hardships, pains and uncertainties. And they overcame those obstacles to create the opportunities that we have and enjoy today. The same responsibility resides with us. How are we going to overcome these obstacles to create new opportunities that were better than before? We can look at people like General John Stark, who was one of New Hampshire's most famous soldiers of the Revolutionary War. And he said, "Live free or die. Death is not the greatest of enemies." Our founding fathers were more afraid of not living than they were afraid of dying. It is that attitude that is part of our foundation that will help us to not only reclaim life, but create a greater life than what we even knew and experienced before. It's going to be a process, but it's a process that we're called to, not just for us, but for the generations that come after us. If you find this information helpful, click the subscribe button, hit the notification bell as we do our best to help you live life well.